In terms of my accent, please just let me know and don't be afraid to ask if you need me to say anything again. Um, yeah, obviously delighted today to talk to you about a community-based health and wellbeing approach to youth homelessness. And I will just share my screen. Initially, it's going to be probably a little bit of me sort of giving you a brief overview of the work that we've done in the UK in England, based in Birmingham, which is kind of like it's a large city in England, which is kind of in the West Midlands of our island. And it's very multicultural, it's very diverse. And it's about 2 hours north of London. But it's one of the cities that has higher rates of youth homelessness compared to other parts of the country. You can also, if there's any questions you don't get to ask today at all, my contact details will come up again towards the end. So feel free to get in touch again if you'd like to. And just to say a huge thank you again to the Centre and to Ham for all of their work in terms of hosting this research visit as well. So the idea of today is that yes, I'll have to give you a bit of brief background to kind of the work that we've been doing so that you can understand how we've come to where I am with the policy brief development. But really, it's an opportunity to kind of try and learn from each other as well, hopefully, in terms of your own expertise, as well as that feeding into potentially where there might be some challenges or things that might be more difficult to implement in terms of the policy brief. So briefly, what I'll cover is what is mental skills training, so that you can kind of see how we have that transition from something that started out as a sports psychology program, and sort of the origins of that and why it's appropriate to support young people experiencing homelessness. And then thinking a little bit about the youth homelessness context in the UK as well, specifically looking at our program called My Strengths Training for Life and the resources that we have for that. And then that kind of takes us nicely into looking at the challenging, harmful stereotypes and sort of the policy brief, and then the discussions that we can have around that, where hopefully my voice will be a little quieter for a while. So I guess to begin, is sort of my interest in sports psychology has come about because I've always loved taking part in sport, and that's initially how I got interested in sports psychology, was probably more around the performance-based elements of the discipline. However, through my own work in special educational needs schools in the UK, and alternative education provision, which in the UK is typically for children that would get excluded on for behavioural reasons, or sort of potentially like involvement in gangs and things like that, is where I was doing a lot of work in that area in tandem to like my master's degree, for example. And that combined with my love of sport kind of led me down the route of becoming much more sports psychology focused. And then as I progressed through trying to think about my next steps, and I became very passionate about working with young people experiencing disadvantage, and obviously still had my love of sport, which I still have now, and had my first sort of foray into proper winter running, although I know it's still quite mild for you guys right now, as part of there was a 10K race this weekend, which which was an interesting but fun experience with the snow. But essentially, when we think about the world's best athletes, or even just how you might use mental skills in your own exercise that you might take part in, the thing we tend to think about first is things like their physical strength, the skills they use in relation to their performance, how do they fuel themselves properly with their nutrition, and that success might look like how well they do in a competition. So like, did they win a medal? And that's the things we tend to focus in on when we think about the world's best athletes, and whoever they might be in terms of our context or our country. But actually a really, really important part that kind of underpins all of those four aspects of sport performance is the way that we use our mental skills or our brain to help us to perform better. So mental skills training is essentially it's a progression of development, and it's very much focused in a strengths-based way. So it's thinking about the things that we can do, and it's the way it's delivered. So through this basic psychological needs supportive delivery style, is a very important foundation to the development of mental techniques, which is things such as breathing, using imagery or self-talk. And basically, the more that those skills get practiced, those techniques get practiced, they become mental skills, which would be something like your ability to regulate your own emotions. So, for example, I was definitely using positive self-talk on Sunday when I was running the race, and there was so much snow that it was like sticking to my eyelashes and weighing them down, and I was wondering what on earth was going on and why did I sign up for this, and using that positive self-talk to sort of challenge that, and when we then can implement those skills, it means that we start to develop sort of higher quality and more robust mental qualities like confidence or motivation, for example, which we can sustain even through periods of turbulence or more challenging situations. And essentially, by doing all of those things, it helps to promote self-regulation across our emotions, thoughts, and behaviours, which overall helps us to improve and maintain our psychological functioning, which can improve well-being as well. So why is mental skills training appropriate for responding to complex and co-occurring needs? Well, we know that the average brain takes approximately 25 years to become fully developed. However, things such as adverse childhood experiences or experience of multiple disadvantage and sort of like chronic stress associated with that can impact brain development. And in particular, the part of our brain that's responsible for our ability to recognize and manage our emotions, decision making, risk, sort of figuring out what's risky and what isn't risky, is the last part of the brain to develop. And so any sort of impediment to brain development impacts this bit even further. So if we think about typical teenage behavior, we'll see that they're probably less risk averse potentially in terms of the way that they think about different situations. So when this is further impacted, they obviously that can take longer to develop, or it takes a more proactive kind of approach to help them develop these skills. And the neuroplasticity of our brains mean that even if we haven't had ACEs or multiple disadvantage, that at any point we can start to develop and use these mental skills to help us improve our self-regulation at any point in our life. And importantly, that strengths-based approach is kind of counter and opposite to what has been a very traditional deficits-based approach to supporting not just youth experiencing homelessness, but generally populations experiencing homelessness, in terms of it being very focused on the individual is the problem. They have no strengths. They don't have motivation to move beyond what's going on for them right now. Whereas when we think about a strengths-based approach and the use of mental skills training, and that kind of its development from the sport background, is actually it's about performance and doing well, and it, although it's underpinned by lots of clinical types of psychology like cognitive behavioral therapy, its packaging in terms of this sport focus actually can really help the young people to engage with the program that I'll come on to explain in a few slides time. So in the UK, because I'm obviously aware that you'll have a lot more knowledge around your own sort of context in terms of youth homelessness. But in the UK at the moment, we are seeing rises in terms of the number of young people experiencing homelessness. So in 2020 to 21, this number was 120,000 young people. And so in just 2 years, you can see that unfortunately, it's not decreasing or it's not stabilizing. It just keeps going up. So we're currently at 136,000 young people. And this is just the young people that present to their local authority. So the number is likely much greater than this in terms of those that don't actually present for support. And again, you can see here on this map that the darker areas are essentially the areas with the greatest prevalence of youth homelessness, and the kind of the medium dark orange. I don't know if I hope you can see my mouse now. This bit here is the area in which we've conducted our work so far, in this sort of central west location, and we're seeing similar trends that we've seen over the past few years in terms of the reasons why young people are experiencing homelessness, and family or friends no longer willing to or able to accommodate them has maintained as the primary reason that we see. And we've sort of seen a similar story in terms of the pattern of domestic abuse, eviction from private or social or supported housing tenancy, and landlords wishing to sell or re-let the property. Interested in terms of the UK context to see if there's any changes in this bottom one over the next sort of, as the figures come out for the next sort of 1 to 2 years, because we're going through quite a strange housing situation in the UK right now with really, really high mortgage rates, which is actually meaning that, and I don't know if that's similar to something going on here, I can see Emily's nodding at me, in terms of landlords are not wanting to rent in this sector because they're not making enough profit based off the increases in their mortgage. So I'm interested to see if we'll see any changes in terms of that in the next 1 to 2 years as the data starts to come out. So that's kind of a bit of an overview, and essentially to say that we, and I'm sure similarly over here as well, is that there's a huge rise in demand for services, and there's the rise for demand, but this is co-occurring with increasingly complex need support from those that are needing the support. However, there's also then at the same time a hugely increased cost of living, cost of running services as a result of the increase in cost of living. And at a time when the government seems to be cutting resources to all of these services left, right, and centre as well. So one way that we have tried to create something that can be sustainable and inexpensive for organisations to try and embed into their practice is something called the My Strengths Training for Life programme, which was originally called mental skills training for life, but the young people didn't like the association of the word mental in terms of like mental health or some of the more negative connotations with that word. So they actually requested to change the name of the program, and I think that really shows the program itself and our work over the last 10 plus years with St Basil's has been very much on that co-production, co-creation, and I think that's a really nice example of a way that we've really embraced that. So essentially the program takes the kind of framework that I showed you before in terms of that mental skill development, and it's delivered in the young people's housing services so that it's easier for them to get to. It's a 10-week program. And it's underpinned by strengths-based psychology, positive youth development, self-determination theory, and other sort of clinical psychology approaches like dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. And it consists of 10 sessions in their local service, where they might do things like a strengths profile, something called a dream team. And these resources are all available on our website, which I'll come to shortly. And then we take them out to the countryside for an outdoor adventure education program, as an opportunity kind of for multiple benefits, really, in terms of the benefits of getting outside of the city, and the health and well-being benefits associated with being in the outdoors in the countryside, but also as an opportunity for some experiential learning, so where they can take the skills that they've used and learned in those 10 sessions and then practice applying them in a new but controlled situation before they then have the opportunity to try and use them beyond the program itself. So MST for Life is underpinned by a specific delivery style, which aims to essentially be that psychologically informed delivery style. So thinking about it being trauma informed. St. Basil's, the community organisation we work with, is a psychologically informed environment itself. So really trying to work in alignment with them in terms of that. And this particular model that we've developed, the CARES model, kind of focuses around 5 key things, which is whether you're delivering a group session, or whether you're working one-on-one with a young person, or even just with your colleagues, about how can you support their competence, so their ability to feel like they have the skills to complete a task, the extent to which you support their autonomy, so the extent to which they have choice or a sense of control over what's going on, which we know can be a really important thing for young people in this context, who often experience very little control, especially in terms of systems and services that might be trying to support them, depending on how well they're managing to navigate those. Relatedness support is really about how we build that rapport and that connection, and starting to see them as individuals and people with skills, that trusting environment, for example, with their peers, but also with adults, because from the sort of this, we think back to the stats, we know that a lot of those reasons is that family often can't accommodate them or aren't willing to anymore, and that can sometimes mean that they experience quite strained and imbalanced relationships with adults. So building that as a positive part of the program is really important. Their ability to engage and clearly communicate with the young people. So that could be, how do they learn and understand as someone facilitating this program or working with a young person? What does engagement mean for that young person? Is actually the fact that for the first 2 sessions they turned up and they stayed 20 minutes, and maybe they didn't actually engage in an activity, but them turning up is a huge thing. And how do you then take that and start to build that and encourage them to engage on like a small step each time? Communication could be like mirroring the language they use, so that it's meaningful to them. So like we have an emotional awareness activity, and the things I might call an emotion or the describe something is often quite different to the way the young people describe some of the terms, but it's about giving them, again, that autonomy and using that and reflecting that back to them. And then that structure and group management is potentially around how do you reinforce things like group agreements, maybe contracts that they've agreed to in terms of their housing provision or a service they're receiving, and how do you reinforce that in a way that is a positive experience for the young person, rather than it kind of being like hey, you've broken the rules and now you can't have this anymore. And also just thinking about if a conversation goes off topic, how do you bring that back in, and that kind of thing. So there's lots more detail on this, but just for the focus of today, I don't want to go much further down that road. So we've done lots of evaluation of MST for Life over the past 10 years. And you can see here some data from a part of the evaluation led by my colleague, Dr. Mary Quinton, and our PI, Jennifer Cumming, that we can see. So where the stars are is essentially where there was like a significant difference between the pre and the post-program data. So we can see that the program was significant in its improvement in the young people's engagement in things within the service and generally in things of their interest, their optimism, their resilience, and their happiness, and particularly, and I think also this is reflected in a lot of the qualitative data we have, but their improvements in their self-worth. So that's just kind of like a little snapshot so you can see that it does work. And ultimately what we've done is we have worked with St Basil's, including the staff, the young people, higher level leaders, to create a toolkit trilogy based on this work, which is free to download on our Sprint Project website, which you can see in the bottom there, and also via the QR code, which will come up again later, so don't panic. But essentially we have 3 toolkits. One includes the actual activities that we deliver on the program, and the kind of the skills and the tools we're trying to get the young people to develop. Then the second toolkit, so the one in the middle, is around how do you do that in line with the CARES model delivery style and that trauma-informed, strength-based approach. And then the final kind of piece of the puzzle is this mental skills training, commissioning, and evaluation toolkit. Because when we think about programs, we often think about the outcomes, which I just showed you, but we really need to know, I guess it's a little bit like baking. Did we follow the recipe to get to the outcomes that we got to, or did you do what I do and chuck in like 6 extra things of chocolate if there's chocolate in there somewhere? Because we need to know that it's not a problem. We just need to know so that we can understand what and how it works. And the toolkit is really aiming to help commissioners, people in policy, to see how they can embed and encourage services and support them to actually be able to deliver these kind of programs as well, because it's all well and good saying you need to deliver in this way. The rest of the system has to come on board to support the embedding and the delivery and the commissioning of such programs as well. And we know that that things like this can be really impactful, not just from the sort of the numbers that I showed you before, but if we this is a quote from one of the young people from the program. When we think about sort of the stigma, the exclusion that young people experiencing homelessness face, as young person has said about the program and particularly the delivery style, that it really goes to show what we can achieve when you have faith in yourself. And that faith stems from the fact that the facilitators believe in us, young homeless people who live in a hostel, who often feel like we've been forgotten about by the rest of society. For them to come and show how passionate they are about us as young people, it only reinforces the fact that we do matter, and it's brilliant. And I think things like this, when we provide a space that can empower young people to get back in touch alongside those other support systems that they need in terms of potentially alcohol and substance misuse, actually more like clinical psychology support that they need in terms of counselling, for example, in relation to perhaps past trauma, etc. And it's amazing that we can have this impact on their own self-belief, because often they can be a lot of internalized stigma as well. But in order for that to be sort of prolonged, we also really need to think about how do we challenge some of these stigmas and these negative stereotypes across the different levels of the system. So it's all well and good that we create these very psychologically informed spaces, but then often when the young people get back out of these kind of psychologically informed bubbles and sort of more independently on their own in the real world, they basically sort of end up facing this framework that you can see in front of you. So this is something that I've started to adapt from a mental illness stigma framework, and something I'm hoping to do in the slightly longer term is to develop specifically a homelessness and stigma framework. But you can see here that it's quite a complex pattern, and this is just relating to stigma, let alone all of the other things that we know is going on in relation to young people experiencing homelessness. And that we kind of have that perspective of the person who is doing the stigmatizing and all of the things that influence them in holding those stereotypes and those viewpoints. And then we have the perspective of the person experiencing the stigma. And sort of how do they internalize it? How do they anticipate stigma that might come up? And how does that impact them? And a key thing that we know is that it really impacts and delays them getting support. So, for example, if people were able to come for support sooner, or they felt more comfortable to come sooner, often it might be that things are less complex if they're able to get that support much sooner. Also, again, that treatment adherence, and we often see a greater sort of decline in terms of things like social well-being, physical and mental health as well. So we can see that it's quite a complex picture, but in Birmingham, we've started to try and sort of chip away at some of this and start to think about how we can change public perceptions surrounding homelessness, and in particular youth homelessness. So over the last 12 months, I was involved in a project so you guys, Carlton Dominion Chalmers Centre, I think I've got that in the right order, hopefully. And we essentially have an equivalent in the centre of Birmingham as well, which is a university-owned space, but that's very public-facing and holds lots of public engagement. Sorry, I think
I assume you lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I may have just got kicked
You're
out.
back.
So I think I might need to share my screen again. Sorry, everybody. There you go. Hopefully, you should all be able to see the slides. Yeah, great. So the exhibition was sort of split into two halves. So the pilot exhibition consisted of these kind of questions that you see on the left and the right, which was really trying to get to grips with how the public in Birmingham, or those visiting Birmingham, what did they know about homelessness? What does it mean to them? How did they think they would cope? And really trying to ask them questions that might get them to think outside of kind of their typical thought processes, or and kind of trying to get them to expand beyond perhaps just how they might react and think when they see someone experiencing homelessness, which is very typically that person who is rough sleeping. We also had things where you could draw pictures. You can see the charity's mascot here, Basil, is drawing and writing. And actually, we found that quite a lot of people thought that they were either not sure or that they'd cope quite badly if they had to leave home, which I think was quite an interesting finding from the exhibition itself. And essentially there was lots of different questions along these lines, and this then fed into the second part of the exhibition, which was based on all of these results. And you can see here where 4 of the young people from our programme actually had such an amazing experience being involved in the project, where they had these professional photos taken, which they were then able to the photographer then shared. They've been able to use them on their like LinkedIn profiles, for example, a sort of like job applications. So they've got professional photos, because we know that things like access to that can be another sort of barrier in terms of progressing beyond where they are when they first join or require housing support services. really getting people to connect back on that human level rather than obviously at the beginning we spoke about all those stats, but every single one of those stats is an individual person having an experience. And I think creating a space where we can kind of connect and create a more inclusive society is really important, and that's something that this project has aimed to do. As part of the project, we also delivered a variety of public engagement activities, one of which has obviously inspired tomorrow's event as well. So one of them was a very family-focused workshop where you can see myself and my colleague Mary have got those, I don't know if you have them here. They're octopus that's like happy on one side and then you turn it inside out and it's like got a sad face. So it's like, yeah, I can see people nodding. So we basically ran a workshop we had children aged between 4 and 12, and we were basically delivering some of their activities and with these octopus, which we had to give them at the end because they were getting too distracted by keep turning them inside and outside. Also a public lecture, and then kind of what I'm going to move on to now is this sort of creative approach and how this, because some of the work from this creative and poetry work is what has led to informing the policy brief that we'll look at shortly. So we delivered 2 different poetry workshops. One, we were very lucky to be joined by Beth Abbott from Been There, Done That Poetry, who is someone who received support from St Basil's and has gone on to set up her own business and published works related to her experience of homelessness. And through these workshops, we collected poems as well as from some of the young people in the different St Basil services. And we've essentially in the middle of collating these into a poetry book, which will be freely available on our Sprint Project website in May/June, depending how quickly I can pull all the final pieces together. And essentially the reason we chose to go down this more creative method is because it can be quite a safe way for people to explore different experiences, either their own experience or engage with other people's experiences and opinions, and sort of so challenging those perspectives. And it can be a really important vehicle for addressing social stigma through its ability to evoke emotional reactions. And when we have an emotional reaction to something, sometimes it can change the way we think about it, and that then impacts our knowledge that we hold on that thing. So that's kind of the reason behind why we chose to use poetry or also art for people that didn't want to write as a way to sort of engage with challenging some of these harmful stereotypes and this very deficit-based perspective of homelessness. Also, it really allows for a collaborative and participant-led approach to knowledge generation and positive social change. So instead of me sitting or standing talking and sharing, it's actually it's the general public or people with lived experience sharing their experience or sharing how they'd like to see things change. And this sort of collaborative method also increases the likelihood of success through the fact that it's coming from multifaceted approaches and different parts of the population. And when we think about this sort of connection between policymakers, service provision, and stereotypes and stigma, they essentially kind of reinforce each other. It's kind of a little bit like the chicken and the egg. I'm not quite sure which one comes first at this stage. But we know that a lot of previous policy and service-based provision has been very deficit-based, informed by societal perceptions of people experiencing homelessness. For example, as I mentioned, them being problems to be solved, it's the individual's faults. They don't want to change their situation. But then equally, when government officials, which we unbelievably had quite recently in the UK with the Home Secretary coming out and saying that homelessness is a lifestyle choice, which was not well received by quite a lot of people in the UK. But for the people that do receive that well, we can see how that almost vicious cycle just starts to perpetuate, where public opinions then inform policy, and then policy essentially is informed by the opinions, and then that just further reinforces them. But what we really want to move to, and what we have already started to move to, and it kind of sounds like from some people's reactions that it's a similar landscape here, but I'd definitely love to learn more about that and how that looks like for you, is really moving to policy and service provision that really thinks across that whole systems approach, that's strengths-based, where we're working with people, seeing their value, highlighting their strengths, and allowing them to create a space where they can reintegrate and feel welcomed back into community rather than constantly feeling excluded. And with an additional focus on the development of key life skills and mental skills to improve well-being and support progression. We often see that for a lot of policy and service provision, that key outcomes and indicators of success are things like, did they return to education, employment and training? Did they manage to move on to independent accommodation? And that's what will the success of a service will be judged on that. However, policymakers and commissioners we've found in the UK, that tends to be their main focus, and that actually the kind of softer skills or the soft outcomes is kind of more employability focused skills, the life skills, are really essential, and actually probably a greater expression of success in terms of an individual's development, because without developing all of those skills, they won't be able to maintain those longer term sort of like key performance indicators that policy and commissioners are looking for. So with that in mind, we already have 2 policy briefs that my colleagues Mary and Jen have created, which is the 2 that you can see here at the bottom. And then this top one here is the one that I'm currently trying to work on, which is thinking about how do we, how can we get sort of public attitude, service provision and policy to kind of work in tandem to start to challenge some of these harmful public attitudes and potentially attitudes within systems and organizations as well, and not necessarily those supporting young people experiencing homelessness as the direct service, but we know that young people who are like maybe supported by a housing service often have multiple other authorities or organizations involved in their care who might not be trained in the same level or the same way that the homelessness service is. And that's where we want to try and create a stronger bridge in terms of that multi-agency working from a strengths-based approach. So I have essentially drafted and begun drafting a policy brief around this and thinking about this interdisciplinary approach in terms of actually when we see services or charities creating campaigns, for example, they often if they're trying to fundraise, the main focus is on that they need to try and demonstrate a need for the service, and that there's people need this and that kind of thing. But actually sometimes what we're starting to learn and wonder whether a more combined approach, obviously the need has to be demonstrated to create the funding, but also thinking about how can services and sort of more generally other organizations. We often have really big retailers that create adverts, even if they don't really have much to do about sort of evoking that emotional response, and thinking about how can they do that in a way that portrays homelessness in different light beyond the sort of stereotypical pictures that we might see. So what I'd like to do now is give you a break from listening to me talk quite so much, which is to sort of move on to discussing potentially some of the recommendations. And I'm just going to check the time as well. You can see that, crikey, that's gone very quick, and I apologize that I have spoken for quite so long. But essentially, to think about those three questions in relation to the different recommendations, or just if you broadly have any more questions or anything you think is sort of useful for me to know, or that you found particularly interesting. And yeah, if there's any bits we don't get to that you thought you had a particular feedback point on that might not get to, then please like pop them in the chat, or feel free to sort of email me after as well. So I guess if we maybe start with the first one, and then we'll maybe see how far we get in terms of time, because I'm aware that it's about 10 to 6. So, and I can also see that there's some new faces as well. So hello and welcome to those of you that have joined as well whilst I've been talking. So I guess the first recommendation is around the campaigning. And I guess I'm not an expert in policy making, I'm not an expert in campaigning and service provision, and I think that's why I wanted this to be a kind of a knowledge exchange. It's very interdisciplinary, and part of the development of my own development in terms of this work has been to try and learn more about this space in relation to being able to better lead an interdisciplinary team around this kind of stuff. And I'm sort of definitely looking for collaborations in terms of people who might want to get on board with sort of as the project develops further down the line as well. So yeah, feel free to chip in if you have any thoughts on things that might be particularly challenged, that you might think are challenging in terms of implementing either the recommendations or more broadly this kind of approach in your services and context.
So in terms of public attitude, I think, like you were saying, we often, we're focusing on the negatives pertaining to homelessness, or like the specific stats pertaining to homelessness. But I also think, so I attended a conference in the fall, the Canadian Alliance on Homelessness conference, and one of the presenters presented facts that I think were more relatable for more Canadians, right? It was on how attainable is home buying, or how attainable, like who is worried about becoming homeless, and the stats were astounding. The regular average Joe is worried about becoming homeless now because of the market. And I think in today's climate, that is really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear the way that they've and I think I think people think, or in the past have often thought as homelessness is something they're never going to experience, or that it's like a really far away thing for them. And I think that's also what creates that sort of that exclusion, isn't it? Is that, or that will never happen to me, and I can't resonate with anything about this person that's having this experience. But yeah, it's actually quite similar in the UK as well, is that actually people have suddenly gone, oh wow, I'm actually I'm not as far away from that as I thought right now.
Yeah. Another thing I guess we do at OCH, so we have an art program, and we often have events where our youth artwork is on display. Like they can choose to have it on display. They can also choose, if they want to sell their artwork, or that sort of thing. So I think that's a great way to show, you know, a unique way for them to each show their story, and their personalities, and yeah, and who they are outside of experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, I think that's really great to hear. And one of the services I've been more closely working with has been kind of this, it's a very new type of service in the UK where there's a typical kind of support workers in there, but they also had a clinical psychologist, an occupational therapist, and a drug and alcohol support worker, all like based within the service every day, rather than them having to seek that from an external organization. And by having that in there, they've been able to offer a lot more variety in terms of the art-based kind of activities as well. But I don't know how much of it they put on display, so I have made a note of that as something that I can share back with them as a good idea. So yeah.
Full of youth artwork right now, so.
Cool. Did anyone else have any thoughts on sort of perhaps any challenges around this? Francine, I can see that you are unmuted.
All right, yeah. So I think those were really great points that were raised about, you know, Ottawa Community Housing Foundation is doing a lot of work to, you know, advance sort of understandings around housing in Ottawa. But I think that the biggest challenge or difficulty is to get people to care outside of this sector, right? I don't know, like I think that's where we're kind of stuck, because I think people working in this area and advocating and doing research like really see the value and the importance in sort of shifting these public attitudes, but it's like where do you get the resources to do that, and you know, to continue the work that you're doing. And like I said, I think there's a lot of smaller community-based organizations doing that work, and researchers like yourself, but I think the challenge is kind of getting the broader buy-in.
Yeah, definitely. I could definitely resonate with that as being a big challenge. And I think, like you say, how do you upscale this? And also, particularly for like funders, they want to see the measures of how you're changing it. And it's a really difficult thing to measure, and probably to access the people who probably most want to challenge the opinions of, and thinking about how do you actually engage with them. And I think that's a much longer term part of the project, and hopefully with some upcoming applications to try and think on a bigger scale, to try and be able to do that. But yes, I think it's getting people to care and allow themselves to get in touch with that kind of empathy and the human experience of someone who is experiencing homelessness, I think is such a big challenge. So yeah, I look forward to hopefully being able to either work with you or just keep in touch on the challenge, and hopefully have maybe some positive news to share in the coming years on the work, rather than just oh yeah, the numbers all went up again. So so I'm kind of conscious of the time, but I just don't know if anyone else had any more general points they wanted to raise, or any sort of other questions before we kind of check out, with it being 6 p.m.
Can I maybe ask one question? Sorry, if people want to read, you can. And this is a very odd question, just sort of given the title of like My Strengths Training for Life. Like, how long ago was this named?
So it was named. So the partnership started 10 years ago. So it's this year is actually the 10-year anniversary of the pilot study of the program, in March, April time. And the program was, so we originally named it Mental Skills Training for Life. And then when we piloted it, that's when the young people said, we don't like this name. So it changed 9 years ago when the young people asked for it to be changed.
Right, and that's super interesting. I'm glad, sorry, I should have provided that context for people who came later, because I wonder if it would be different now, given how much awareness around mental health has changed and how much more open youth are to speaking about their mental health. That's why, just when you mentioned at the start, I was like, oh, that's interesting that they wanted this title changed, but.
Yeah, I would think it would be interesting to see. And also, I wonder whether there would be a difference in more of like general youth population compared to those who've had like more traumatic and probably much more complex experiences with probably mental health services. Because I think that's perhaps where some of that apprehension came from as well, in terms of the context specific. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there was like if you were going to go and deliver that out in schools, they might be a little bit less bothered by the name, the original name.
Great, thank you.
No worries. Perfect. And I can see, thank you very much to Jihan, that there's a feedback form, which is very, very short. If you wouldn't mind feeding that out afterwards, and I know that we'll send it out again if you don't get a chance to access it today. And yeah, just a huge thank you to everybody for joining today. And if there is any questions you didn't get to ask or anything you wanted to say, I don't necessarily have to rush off. So I'm happy to stay online for a little bit longer if anyone wants to discuss anything through. So I'll just hang around at the end. I will quickly skip through these. Yeah, just a reminder that we also have the in-person event tomorrow at the Carlton Dominions Trauma Centre. So we'll be there from 4 till 5:30, and that's really a chance for you or for anyone who's planning to attend to have a go at their own poetry, maybe a go at their own art. There'll be drinks, there'll be much more interactive than today. So yes, and now I know where that is as well, because I've passed it twice. So that's also really great. But yeah, hopefully I might see a few friendly faces there as well. And yeah, just a huge thank you again for everybody for coming along today. And if you want to keep up to date with what we've been up to or access any of the resources, you can do that at the sprintproject.org website, where we have all the toolkits you can download. That's where the poetry book will be once that's launched in the spring. And we also have like weekly blog posts that go out on different ways that you can use like the mental skills or other project that's going on more broadly in terms of some of our sports psychology work as well, if that's a general interest for anyone as well. So thank you so much everyone for coming along. I will stop sharing now. And yeah, it was really lovely to meet you all, and I'll perhaps hopefully see a few of you tomorrow as well.